Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. Our next guest is someone you doubtless know. He is the most frequent guest by far, by a factor of some big number, on our nighttime show at 8 p.m. He's probably the most frequent guest on Fox News. We haven't checked, but he's in the running for sure, and there's a reason for that. Mark Steyn is a genius. We're not overselling that. There aren't many geniuses striding the earth, but Mark Steyn, in his particular way, is. And so we have him on, try to do it twice a week, every single week. And the thing about a Mark Steyn interview is that not only is none of it rehearsed, we never tell Mark Steyn what we're talking about. So every question is cold and by definition comes out completely of left field. You can throw Mark Steyn anything. You could say, how's Kamala Harris doing? Not so tough. You could say, how are the Seychelles Islands in January? Out of the park. It doesn't matter what you ask him. He has an informed, wise, and usually hilarious answer. No one else can do that. If you haven't seen Mark Steyn on our show, then you don't watch regularly. Here's what you're missing. So here you have Eric Swalwell on some kind of cheetah hunt with his coolies. It seems so old school for a progressive man like Eric Swalwell. What do you make of it?
Well, it is, and he's obviously taken off his shirt to intimidate his faithful native bearer, and the native bearer has clearly just said, 1,000 pardons, Effendi. I bow before your magnificent imperialist nipples. Is that the front hump of your camel, or are you just pleased to see me? I mean, literally the emperor's new clothes. Like, so to a fool, Joe Biden may look like a guy who spends most of his day sitting in the basement eating tapioca, but to the wise man, he's Cary Grant in that touch of mink. He has an effortless, natural style. I would be happy to pitch an eye-rolling hour every night on this channel for these kinds of stories.
He's also our crochet correspondent, and so he joins us now.
Well, I think she just made a rather remarkable confession there when she said, I've crocheted more Afghans than I can tell you. I believe that's a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, and probably the real reason why we're pulling out of Afghanistan. I had a staffer write it out for me on this piece of paper. But anyway, you make Jim Crow look like Nigel Peregrine Falcon. These days, there are much better movies, Tucker, over on CNN. You may recall this classic from Brian Stelter. He's been nominated at next month's Oscars. He's up against Jeffrey Toobin for Best Animated Shorts. So he just stands up. And he goes, it's 20 minutes before dawn on D-Day, and this 9-star general says to me, Mr. President, it's too dangerous for you to go in there. But I say, the Minutemen are taking on the Bengal Lancers. So I flew in on a glider from Diego Garcia, and we came under heavy fire from a group of whirling dervishes holed up in Bridget Bardot's apartment outside Euro Disney. And I said to them, I'm the first Biden in 1,000 years to go to college, so I know what it's like to be the best of the best. This was classic Joe Biden. He's back. His mojo has returned. His mojo knows what state it's in.
I just drooled on myself. I don't. Okay. I just want to alert our producers to take that, put it on a DVD, and sell it, and we'll give the money to charity. But that was unbelievable. I would vote for you for president after that. I just want to be completely honest. You hear a that made me laugh the second time. You hear a sentence like that, and you think there's no way he can land that thing. He's gonna crash on the side of a mountain. A sentence like that can't be completed. And every time it is. Mark Steyn, unbelievable. I'm not much for flattery, but that's unbelievable.
You know, I had several critical tweets after that saying there's no such thing as a 9-star general. Steyn doesn't know what he's talking about. The internet has made everyone incredibly literal.
Yes, it has, and no wiser. So people who watch our nighttime show regularly love you. They love you. And we know that from the numbers, but also from common sense and just running into people. I don't think they know that much about you. I never ask. We haven't even met that many times in real life, though I'm your greatest fan, as you can tell. To the extent you're comfortable, like, tell us where you're from. Like, what life produced that?
Well, I was born in the Wellesley Hospital in Toronto, which they tore down, not just because I was born there, but for various other reasons. So you can't go and visit it, and there'll never be a plaque there. My parents were Irish and Belgian. I was at...
Nationals? So they were from those countries?
Well, under British nationality law at that time, the concept of an Irish national was not universally recognised. But my mother, well, that's the difference. My Irish father was just like mooching around the colonies for a bit, and my Belgian mother was a foreigner, and her childhood memories were being taunted as a dirty DP, which was a displaced person, which is what they called people after the war. So, you know, an Irishman in Canada is not foreign, and a Belgian in Canada in those days was. So there's like subtle differences in the gradations of assimilation and that kind of thing. But I had a peripatetic childhood, and I wandered around, and I finally wound up in New Hampshire, mainly because...
Wait, stop. So where... Okay, so you've elided over many years here. So you're born in Toronto in a hospital that no longer exists to parents who were not from Canada.
Yeah.
And then you go, where were you educated?
I was at, bulk of my education was at King Edward School in England, which is J.R.R. Tolkien's thing. So when I say I was at the same school as the Lord of the Rings guy, people think I was at school in New Zealand, because unfortunately the film of Lord of the Rings has led everyone to believe... I mean, New Zealand's... That's like 85% of New Zealand's economy is Lord of the Rings fans going to tour the actual part of New Zealand where J.R.R. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. And the fact that he wrote it... You know, the fact that the guy was from Warwickshire and he wrote it at Oxford and he was sitting in pubs telling it to C.S. Lewis has all been forgotten, and New Zealand's getting all the bang for the buck from that.
So has C.S. Lewis been forgotten?
Yeah.
How did you wind up at school in England?
Well, my parents, my father at one point wanted to go back to Ireland. He was restless for a while. He mainly liked France because of its Epicurean perfection.
Yes.
Which I sort of thought was a bit silly at the time, but I kind of got a bit more respect for that.
Is that you on the screen?
Yeah, that's with my father. He's, I think that's at the Toronto Zoo with a monkey. What I like about that is there's me with the monkey, and my father's just like holding his cigarette. Like, you could do that at the zoo.
An unfiltered cigarette draped over your shoulder. You don't see that a lot in family portraits now.
No, and I think that's quite... I'm cool with it. The monkey's cool with it.
And you're wearing something that's clearly 100% wool.
Yeah, I'm like...
And your father has a necktie on at the zoo. Now, you are not very old.
No.
But that looks like it was taken in a completely different age.
Yeah, it does look like a completely different age. I mean, my kids can't get over... The first thing, as you say, they can't get over why a man is wearing a necktie at the zoo. Then they can't get over the way the zoo is letting him hold the monkey with one hand and his cigarette with the other. The whole thing... There's like several different layers of hate crime going on.
No, I mean, that could be Bulawayo 1903.
Yeah. It's a completely lost world. And in some ways, I miss it. I think it speaks. I prefer. I would say I'm culturally conservative more than politically conservative, because a lot of conservative politicians drive me nuts. But I regret lost worlds, and I regret that my own childhood has become a lost world in what doesn't seem a long time ago.
I grew up in a very different place in a very different way, but it's also gone, and it makes me sad. So your parents at some point returned to Europe.
Yeah.
And you go with them, and that's how you wind up in boarding school in England?
Well, I mean, basically had the bulk of my education in the UK, in England. And my school was the last school, perhaps certainly in the UK and maybe even in the world, in which Latin was compulsory, for example, all the way to something like 16 or 17. So it was a serious school. And
did you board there?
No, I didn't board. I was a day pupil, and again, that's something like going on a long, whatever it was, a 20-mile train journey every day is not something that kids do on their own now and things. So I like that world. It was, we had to wear silly uniforms, so the rough kids in the city would occasionally want to beat the crap out of us. So I felt that was character forming too. That if you have to wear silly caps and blazers and boaters and in the summer and that kind of thing, that the rougher lads sort of give you a quick lesson in life, and so I feel it's character building to make.
Did they cane you?
Yeah, they had light corporal punishment, but it did exist. So. But I enjoyed. I wasn't very good at it, but I enjoyed the seriousness of the. I did Greek. I never went to university, and as you know, on Twitter, people always going, well, Stein is completely unlettered. Why are we listening to him? Well, I can idu althis ho thrasaboulos ten technek epidek nutai kai epiten kephalen his stamenos. Which most people on Twitter can't do. That's, behold, again, Thrasaboulos shows off his technique while standing on his head. And that's a very useful sentence if you're in Greece. Unfortunately, in Greece, they don't speak ancient Greek, but, you might find an Albanian or Macedonian who recognizes it from his school. But I felt I liked high school education that I had was serious, and it wasn't serious for my, no disrespect to the particular school they went to, but it wasn't serious and demanding for my kids. It wore them out. My daughter had one of these. She went to visit another school officially. They had an exchange or something. So she goes to this high school in Vermont, and she's there for the Day of Gay Silence, or over the crimes against gay people. And so she's sitting there in silence all day, so it's a rather frustrating day for her. And then she goes back to her own school the following day, and they'd scheduled the Day of Gay Silence for that day too. So she had 2 days of gay silence in a row, but she didn't get Latin and she didn't get Greek, and it was, it's a different kind of education there.
Well, I mean, a serious high school education. I mean, you're one of the best educated guests we have, and one of the most best educated people I know, and you didn't go to college. And so maybe a system in which you're not expected, in which everyone is not expected to go to college, puts more emphasis on a primary education.
Well, I think that's
secondary education.
I think actually if you don't get K through 8 right, you can stay there to grade 28, grade 38, and it doesn't make any difference. That's the most important thing. And so all this thing, the whole discussion on education here, which is the biggest structural defect in the United States, is that, I think Biden just did it the other day. We need even more people to go to university for even longer. So, the problem is that they're expected to do a bachelor's degree in 4 years. Maybe if we made it 9 years, they'd finally get it right. The fact is, if you don't get K through 8 right, all the rest is a complete waste of time. And don't forget, in America, the average American in 1940 had an 8th grade education. America, the superpower, was built by 8th graders. It was 8th grade America that became the dominant military power, the dominant economic power, the dominant cultural power on the planet. And now we have 28th grade America, and it's all going to hell.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think education has become a racket, but I also think it's the actual I think it's an ancient seduction of civilizations, that civilizations soften, so that it's a natural process to that extent. It's not natural to soften over transgender bathrooms or pregnant men or that kind of thing. That's what makes it difficult, certainly for a satirist to observe, because it's a form of civilizational decline in its particulars that we haven't seen, but its outline would be familiar to the Romans or to anybody else. And I think that's where, as I said, I'm culturally conservative. I've never been other than culturally conservative. And that's where you have frustrations with political conservatism, because it's so far behind when you get to all that stuff.
So why are you culturally conservative? What is it that you would like to conserve about the culture?
Well, I believe in the great Western inheritance, which means that you don't think of things. And when people go on about Russia, for example, yeah, Russia is a politically barbarous nation and has been for most of its history. But on the other hand, it's given us Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff and Gogol and Chekhov and Pushkin. Yeah, so it's a serious contributor to Western civilization. So clearly the Russian people have got something going for them. And I started as a disc jockey, and so I played, top 40 hits, but I always, I didn't live in that moment, even when I've had friends who were pop stars in both Quebec and the UK, and I like them as, I enjoy their company, and I'm happy they got to number 3 in the hit parade. But I wasn't ever someone who just lived in that in that moment, which I don't think is a conservative thing. I don't think it's conservative to get excited because Kanye West says something that appears to be contrary to the cultural ethos. And I always found the most pathetic thing was when dear old National Review used to run, I think they were an annual feature for a while, the 20 greatest conservative rock songs, because a rock song is not inherently, what they mean is that George Harrison is in the Beatles and it's fantastic, and he's playing guitar there and they have all these hits, and then the first tax return he has to fill in after he's become a pop star, he discovers that he has to pay 19 shillings in the pound income tax on his mega star earnings, and so he goes and writes Taxman. Let me tell you how it will be. There's 19 for you and 1 for me, and all that. And that's not a conservative. If a conservative pop star is someone who's thinking of moving to Switzerland because the tax rates are too high, it's pathetic and desperate to pretend that is somehow what being conservative is about.
I think you just summed up the magazine fairly effectively. Pathetic and desperate. Excuse me.
And that was in their butcher days.
Yeah, that was back when people read. So, to digress once more, because that's what I do for a living. Your first job was as a disc jockey. So you graduate.
Well, no, my first job was as a busboy at the Westbury Hotel in Toronto, and I'm not, that is a fine skill in itself, but I'm happy to do 20 minutes on being a busboy. But I could already feel television sets being switched off across the nation.
So you graduate high school, and where do you go? To do what? What are your plans?
Well, I had wanted to do classics at Oxford, at Merton College, Oxford. I would have had an entirely different life. I wanted to do that.
To do that meaning teach?
No, to study, to get a whatever it is, a bachelor's or whatever or I think at Oxford it's an MA. And I would have liked to have just gone to Oxford and done Greek and Latin, and my results were terrible. And in one of those, you know, normally in that kind of situation, you're okay, well, you can't do classics, greats, I think they call it at Oxford, greats at Oxford. But, you know, why don't you do, you know, political science at Edinburgh or Belfast or something? And instead of that, I just said, nuts to this. And I paid, I think it was £59 for a budget flight one way to New York, got on the Greyhound after running out of money rather prematurely and sleeping under the statue of George VI at Niagara Falls, the folds of his robe in stone. They'll shelter you from the wind and rain. And it's a beautiful statue, actually. But on the Canadian side, obviously, not the American.
I assume it's been torn down by now, but yes, I bet it was.
If it's not, that's one of the advantages. Sometimes these slave owners, just their garb, garb carved in stone, will protect you from the elements if you're looking for somewhere to sleep. That's one reason. If you need another one, that's another reason not to tear these statues down. After that, I wound up on not terribly important radio stations, just playing whatever. I mean, I once wrote to a radio station offering my services, thinking it was it was a kind of easy listening adult contemporary, Barbra Streisand singing "You Don't Bring Me Flowers," that kind of thing. And I got there and I discovered, like 10 minutes into the interview, I divined that it was actually for a classical show. And I didn't know a lot about classical music, but I bluffed my way through the interview and got the show. And I think that's, I never regretted taking jobs where you acquire knowledge. And I think that's quite a good.
So how long were you a disc jockey?
Well, I would guess I was a disc jockey for something like 3 or 4 years. I had the pleasure of telling your boss, Mr. Murdoch, this once when he gave me an award. I got fired in a humiliating way. And you know, when you go into radio stations, in reception, they've got like portraits of the disc jockeys sitting behind the girl at the desk. And as I was fired and told to leave the building, and I'm walking out, the girl at the desk just unhooks my portrait and hands it to me. So I'm like walking out with my official portrait that nobody has any use for, and just the empty nails. It was a very humiliating thing. And I wrote a piece. I wrote a droll column and just mailed it to the Times of London, thousands of miles away. And 4 weeks later, Mr. Murdoch sent me a cheque for £100, and I thought, this is great. I've never had a 3-figure cheque before. I'll be able to live on this for the next 3 months. And of course, I'd spent it in 48 hours, so then I had to write another piece and mail it to Mr. Murdoch, and that becomes a habit, as you know, in the journalism profession.
So you just became a journalist out of desperation?
All the people I admire, and that's again what I find so odd about America, this idea that journalism is a calling. All the people I ever knew had only gone into journalism because they were completely desperate. I knew a guy who used to write...
That's why I went into it.
Yeah. Well, I knew a guy who he wrote for the Nairobi Times, and he told me that I said, oh, that's fantastic. I think he was going to give me some inspiring story on how he got into journalism. He said, no. He goes, my father left me a copper mine in Zambia, and then the government nationalized all the all the copper mines, and so I was a broke loser. And when you've got no skills, when you've got nothing you can do, writing is about the only thing that you can do. And that is why they've wrecked it here in the United States by making it just another outpost of American over-credentialism.
Right, like being a dental hygienist.
Yeah. And it's absolutely pathetic. There was a neighbor of mine in New Hampshire. Now, she lived in the family homestead. Her family had arrived in 1763, hacked their way through the woods, built the building they live in. They owned it free and clear. She wanted to work for the Atlantic Monthly, for which at the time I write. So she wanted to go to Columbia Journalism School, and they would have mortgaged their farmhouse that their great whatever built in 1763, and for the privilege of editing my copy, right? So in other words, the editor has to go to Columbia Journalism School and take out a $250,000 loan to edit a guy who left school at 18 and bummed around as a disc jockey. That's the over-credentialization of American life.
Did she do it?
No, because I said to her, this is too sad. This is ridiculous. There's nothing. I mean, the journalism thing is particularly. People go and they take $250,000 in debt for a job that these days pays 30 grand a year, if you're lucky. It's completely ridiculous, and it's killed American writing. People sometimes say, why does Carlson have Stein on? Every time I switch on TV or I pick up a magazine, there's all these people from the UK, from Canada, from Australia. The late night shows, that's a clean sweep by the British Commonwealth, from some relatively talented Canadians, the Scots guy who was on late night for a while, all the way to Trevor Noah from South Africa, who hasn't actually said anything funny since he landed in America. But it's a clean sweep for the British Commonwealth. The same thing with a lot of, Christopher Hitchens and co in the newspapers, because I think institutions like Columbia Journalism School have actually just killed American writing.
I've never hired a single person from journalism school, and I never would. And I only went into journalism because I was getting married and I had to get a job. And the two places I applied, I wanted to teach or work for the government, and both turned me down. So I was a desperate man, and writing is. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. So then you start writing for the Times of London.
Yeah, and I wrote for,
which is kind of at the top of the pile.
Well, the interesting thing to me, again, which I could never, I don't want to keep bashing, I'm the least anti-American person on the planet in many ways, but the worst aspect of America is its press. And what I always loved about London is the most competitive newspaper market in the world. So if you write, people are poaching you back and forth. It's not even a particularly political thing, because The Guardian likes to have its token right, and certainly did back then, like to have its token right-wingers just to rile people up. Same thing when I wrote for the National Post in Toronto, but nobody in America thinks Toronto is a consequential town, but it has a competitive newspaper market. So does Montreal. And so do most parts of the world, and some seriously competitive ones, which by the time you get to Pakistan, which is why their newspapers are more readable than America's.
Dawn.
Yeah, exactly. Dawn.
I spent a lot of time reading Dawn in Islamabad.
Yeah. And Dawn is a better read than the New York Times.
I completely agree with that. And more interesting.
Yeah, and the New York, it is actually more interesting. And what I could never get over here is the way the funny, like if you opened up the op-ed page of the New York Times, there'd be a serious column at the top and a serious column in the bottom left-hand corner, and then tucked away in the bottom right-hand corner, they'd have the designated funny guy, who was supposed to be funny about barcode scanners in supermarkets and things like that. And I always thought, no, if you're going to be funny, you should be able to be funny about war and pestilence and all the heavyweight things.
Yes. And
just making jokes about barcode scanners in supermarkets for 30 years until they put you out to pasture, like the so-called funny columns in American papers. I could never get over that sealing it off, sealing 90% of life off from what the designated humor columnist is allowed to be funny about. The American newspapering killed itself.
Yeah, and it deserves to die, that's for sure. One of the things the Brits are funny about that's not even comprehensible to the American news consumer is obituaries. There's this amazing tradition of obituaries in English language newspapers around the world, other than the United States. You were one of the great obituary writers. Tell us what an obituary should be, and then recall, if you will, some of your favorites.
Well, it's true that, again, that tradition doesn't exist here. I find there's the thing they do at the New York Times is they bank obituaries, so that, like, you're not dead yet, but assuredly there's somewhere at the New York Times there's an obituary for you on file, and
I'm sure it's pretty positive.
And it's and it's great, it's terrific, and by the time it's published, 45, 50 years hence, the guy who wrote it will be dead, but they'll still run it, and they'll do, well, can you just instead of he died at 38, he died at 112. They'll just like make that small correction. But otherwise it'll run. And I could never do that. I could never actually write about anyone who hadn't yet died.
They're called advanced obits.
Yeah, and I could never do that, and I hated the concept. And the other thing I think is you always have to have a certain sympathy. Even you have to at least have the not sympathy, but empathy, which is a most abused word these days. But you have to be able to understand the guy in his own terms, which is, I think, is difficult if he's just like a designated bad guy. Like I wrote an obituary about a Utah polygamist, and the Atlantic, who'd commissioned it, had expected me just to, piss all over the guy. And in fact, when you read about his life and the choices he made, you have to understand them, which of course is the great issue today, because, we take some guy who died in 1548 and so he doesn't hold the correct views for our moment, and so he's an evil being. You have to understand people in the context of their time.
Can I ask you to pause, because I'd love an answer to this. So I'm not defending polygamy, which I don't practice, and I oppose, and all that normal caveats, but the same people who are telling you that the nuclear family is completely outdated and any combination is not only cool but preferable to the nuclear family are deeply offended by polygamy. I once raised a defense of a polygamist, not because I'm for polygamy, but because, I don't know, having a bunch of kids, taking responsibility for them, I'm for that.
Yeah.
And wow, I got attacked. Why is polygamy the one family arrangement that just sets them off?
Well, because here it's traditionally associated with unfashionable people. Basically, if you say the word polygamy to most Americans, they're thinking of some stern-faced patriarch in Utah with 5 wives. Now, the fact is, statistically speaking, in the Western world, the main practitioners of polygamy these days are Muslims, and their arrangements are de facto recognized by, for example, welfare in France, welfare in Ontario, for the purposes of inheritance tax in the United Kingdom, and that kind of polygamy, nobody wants to go anywhere near. Now, as you point out, the left is completely incoherent on this, because they're all for the same-sex marriage, so the sex of the participants doesn't make any difference. Therefore, they say, no. It's like man taking a wife. That's not what it's about. It's about expressing your commitment and your love for each other. Well, if the sex of the participants doesn't make any difference, why should the number of the participants make any difference?
I have made this case. They go crazy when you make the case.
Yeah.
But I don't really have any kind of vested interest in it either way. I think it's just interesting.
I'm not in favor of polygamy, but if anything can be anything, which is where we are now, so if a man can be a woman and then marry another woman, or marry a so-called pregnant man or whatever, then why is it that the polygamists are uniquely out of favor? And because they're associated with Utah and a particular kind of
I think that's right. 'Cause, I mean, my view is if a professional athlete can have 9 kids out of wedlock and brag about it, take responsibility for none of them. No. Here you have someone who's saying, no, these are my children. I'm their father. I'm married to their mothers.
Right.
Look, again, I'm not doing it. I'm not into it. But you're taking responsibility for the kids. Why shouldn't we applaud that?
Yeah.
No, send them to jail. Okay.
Well, that's basically what they say. Well, on the one hand, you have these like people who suddenly can become worldwide icons, and they've like knocked up a selection of baby mamas, and so there's all kinds of former girlfriends, partners, all these euphemisms.
It's always a fiance.
Yeah.
When they die, it's always a fiance. Right, yeah. We were about to get married.
They get upgraded. Yeah. And they're all, but they are all basically euphemisms for a man who left huge amounts of human wreckage in his wake.
Right.
But as you say, some guy in Utah, he's taken care of all the children by all his wives. That guy is deserving of unique scorn. And it's just, the whole point about the leftist worldview is it doesn't have to cohere because they have the power calculation.
Right.
And so if you leave, it's true with what's going up gone up in Canada this summer, where dozens of churches have been burned, and dozens of Catholic churches. And if you heard that dozens of Christian churches had been burned, you'd say, oh, well, what is this? Is this a story out of Sudan or Pakistan or whatever? Or maybe the wake of the Iraq war, where the Christian community got decimated on our watch. No, it's all happening in Canada, Alberta and Manitoba. It's not a story in Canada. Dozens of churches burn, and it's not a story. Whereas if you, for example, left rashers of Canadian bacon on the step of a mosque, that would be a story for weeks. So the leftist worldview is always the power calculation. What belongs to the past? Traditional ideas about traditional churches, traditional institutions, and what belongs to the Rainbow Coalition of the future. And it's just a power calculation.
How did you get to America? You've lived and traveled in more countries, I think, than anybody I know who's not a professional diplomat. I can never mention a country that you haven't been to, whose political system you don't understand, whose prime minister you don't know personally. It's almost unbelievable, and I don't think you're making it up. And then you wind up in rural America, like real rural America.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say, but I know where you live. And I'm familiar with the town, actually. And it's real rural America. It's not, you know what I mean, Woodstock, Vermont or something. You live in actual rural America.
Yeah.
Probably the only person from away in your town. How the hell did you wind up there?
Well, I was on an Amtrak overnight train from Montreal to New York that broke down in the middle of the night. And so they throw us all off the train. Amtrak's ridiculous, averages, I believe it averages, or it did before they cancelled it, 16 miles an hour between Montreal and White River Junction.
It's a very modern country we live in.
Yeah, so you could actually bicycle, you could out-bicycle the Amtrak Montrealer. And they throw us all off the train, and eventually they send a little van to take us to an inn. And I just drew the curtains in the morning, looked at them, I thought, oh, it's quite nice here. I'd never really thought about it. It was just somewhere you pass through en route from A to B. And I had the classic disastrous real estate deal where I bought a 200-year-old farmhouse that needed 200 years of work on it. So I'd done it in a stupid way because I thought, oh, this would be nice for a couple of ski weekends, maybe a week at Christmas. And of course, it's just, continuous. And in the course of that, I discovered what Tocqueville discovered, that small town government in northern New England is the best form of government that man has yet devised. If you've got a problem, and this is why people who think it's all about if you're in Latin America, it's all about the president. If you're in a town and you don't like critical race theory, look, there's only 400 adults in the town. You can make a fuss about it. Well, you can call the guy, you can call the chairman of the school board because he's in the phone book and tell him you don't like critical race theory. It's not like you have to call, some head office in Washington or in Europe called the European Union in Brussels, it's one of your neighbours. And if you don't like what your neighbour's doing, you can go to school board meetings and force him to change it. And if he doesn't change it, you can run for school board. And it's not as good as it was because there have been too many. I mean, one of the untold statistical phenomena has been the consolidation of school districts over the last 80 or so years in America, and that's generally delivered them just into the hands of more centralized control and more unionization and all the rest of it. But this is still, of all the places I've lived, it's the only place where if you wake up in the morning and you go down the hill and the road hasn't been plowed, you can call your town highway agent and demand to know why it hasn't been plowed. If that happens to you in Provence, good luck getting hold of somebody in Paris to come and fix your road. You know.
What do they think of you in your little town?
Well,
you're clearly not from there. I mean, you can't kind of hide that.
Yeah, no, and there are people who, you know, which I don't. I turned down a gig on, I think it was Vermont Public Radio. I'd had to do something for Australian radio, and they found me a studio at King Arthur Flower in Norwich, Vermont, in the basement where Vermont Public Radio, their thing, and the lady at the end, she was listening. She said, "Oh, yeah, you're quite good. Would you like to do commentaries on Vermont Public Radio? We'll give you $50 a time." And I said, "No, because if I was a listener to Vermont Public Radio, I wouldn't want to wake up and hear me every morning. I mean, I understand that in the end, people like their communities. Cultural continuity is important. So you can have one guy like me in a town who like comes down to the general store and talks in a weird accent, but he's trying in a vaguely pathetic way to fit in. You know, so I wear plaid when I'm in New Hampshire, and I have a pickup truck, and I'm trying my best. But like one of the guys was working on my house, he went in, he had to move my truck. So he goes and climbs in the truck, he starts the ignition, drives it down the hill to get it out of the way, and immediately he switches on the ignition. The Judy Garland CD I have in the truck comes on, and he's going, "Oh my God, I can't," you know, and I was doing so well. I wore the plaid, I had the pickup truck, but I had the Judy Garland CD. And, you know, that's the main reason I have a pickup truck is because it's actually very good for carrying the larger Judy Garland box sets in it. You know, it's so at a certain, you know, you can fake it up to a certain point, but there's always a giveaway.
Northern New England is, you know, its own world. It's set apart from the rest of the country. It's huge, the largest forest in the continental United States is there, but it has this kind of weird cultural connection to parts of the South. And country music is a thing in Northern New England. A lot of country music. Have you fallen for that?
I like old time. Before country, it was country, because country music now is basically like 1970s rock, as I think of it. And my preference for that would be the earlier. I love Hank Williams. I think Hank Williams is a brilliant songwriter, and like that generation. And before country and western, it was what they called hillbilly music, and I like a lot of that, and I like a lot of western swing from Texas. But I don't believe, you know, the thing about conservatism is, in the end, it's about individuals and individual taste, and so I don't believe that it's useful to say, well, this is conservative culture, and this isn't, because if you look at it, in the end, all the, like NASCAR does as much pandering as the New York City Ballet, and in fact, when you think of it, you know, the New York City Ballet has screwed over conservatives less than NASCAR has with its pandering. So I respect these things, but I don't like the fakeness of it. When I used to guest host for Rush was brilliantly attuned to the sort of cultural rhythms of America, and I didn't think it's helpful to me to. I used to joke. I mean, he introduced me once to a very famous American footballer, but he said, Stein knows nothing about, American sports, because I'm into rugby or whatever. And it's not worth trying to fake it. And so on the day after the Super Bowl or whatever, when I was on Rush, I would always be perfectly honest. I'd say, I don't, or I'd say, well, I thought it was all going great until the 7th inning stretch when they sang "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," and then I'd realised I'd gotten too far out on the branch and I'd plummeted like Wile E. Coyote into the pit below. I think that fake thing, just let people, if you cultural conservative, this is where people don't understand something like Make America Great Again. They think it's sort of racist, and no, Trump's position was that Sweden should make Sweden great again.
Of course.
And Tajikistan should make Tajikistan great again, and Papua New Guinea should make Papua New Guinea great again. That you should have enough cultural confidence in whatever's your bag, just to understand that it's not about this one-size-fits-all thing.
Are you going to stay?
Oh yeah. I think when you fall in love with a place. I mean, I fell in love with my corner of New Hampshire initially because of its natural beauty, and I like the way the clapboard houses look so snug, and it's the perfect architectural style for fitting into the mountains and the lakes and all the rest of it. And then as I said, I discovered town government, and I thought that I loved going to town meeting. Obviously I couldn't vote, and the town clerk always kept her beady eye on me.
Lest you try?
Yes, but I was fascinated by, they had there was a discussion about putting a fence around the town dump. You know these things. They're all these things. And it was like the fence was $1,200. And all these sort of old timers, well, I agree we should have a fence, but I don't think we've got a $1,200 problem here. And eventually it would go through for like $500 after we'd talked about it for 3 hours or whatever. And that's absolutely right. And the problem here is that you talk about 3 hours and you get the $1,200 fence down to $500. And then at the national level, you have a $3.5 trillion, $4.5 trillion, $7.8 trillion budget for which there is no scrutiny whatsoever. And, American national government doesn't work because the congressional districts are now so populous that they don't represent the people. They represent the handful of players in each district who know how to get the guys on the phone. So it doesn't work. It doesn't work at the $7.8 trillion level, but it works. It still works.
So scale matters. Bigness is bad.
Yeah. And I think that the minute you have big government doesn't just mean big government. It means that it's no longer, at a certain point, it can no longer be representative of the people. So if you have 300 and something million under the congressional system. And I say this with respect to India, which is the world's largest democracy, and where right now I would adjudge that, federalism in India works better than federalism in the United States. But the minute you have these, don't forget, like the New Hampshire House has as many representatives more or less as the British House of Commons. And so for a 60th of the population, more or less. And that's, so a representative there, if he doesn't necessarily know all the people he represents by name, he knows a significant chunk of them.
So you've lived all over the world. I think you still may. I'm not going to ask you, but in the 5 years you've been doing our show, there's always a 2 or 3 month period where you just disappear. I've never asked you where you go. We just get a call saying Mark Stein's not available for the next couple of months. Where is he? I'm not going to say. So I'm not going to ask you now.
Yeah.
But I suspect...
I'm actually just around the corner from the Fox DC bureau, face down in the Coke and Hookers. But I try to make
You're
it
on a
sound
bender.
as if, but I try to make it sound as if it's a little bit more exotic.
I suspect you're in foreign countries. That's what I have heard. I've never, again, because I'm indirect too, just like you, I've never asked. I'm not going to ask now.
Yeah.
But you have a lot of perspective on countries. I guess that's the point I'm making. What are the things that America should watch out for going forward? What are the real threats, do you think?
Well, just to say why that is, I think at a certain point you have to go and see places for yourself.
I absolutely agree with that.
And I think that's particularly true if you're in the media. I mean, you know that a lot of what the media do is phony. So 9/11 happens, and within 10 days, every commentator is an expert in the fierce Pushtun goat herd and all the rest. They'd never heard the word Pushtun 10 days earlier, but now suddenly they have to appear as experts in it. And I never particularly cared for that, so I like to go and actually get a grip on those places firsthand, which I always like to do, just to reassure myself. And at this particular time, to go to sort of circuitously answer your question, my problem right now is that Western civilization is sliding off a cliff, and most people in the Western world aren't even aware of that, which is tragic. So how do you stop it if they're not even aware of it? And one thing I've noticed, and you travel to these places, that actually the Western world right now gets more west the further east you go.
That is so true.
So that by the time you wind up if you're having dinner with a politician in the Baltic states or in Slovakia or Hungary, they're talking like reasonably normal people.
That's right.
Who, when they discuss politics, are calculating the national interest of the Czech Republic or Estonia or wherever.
We're going to Budapest next week for this exact reason.
Yeah. And you will find that if you encounter any of the wackiness in Budapest, it's because, about pregnant men or transgender bathrooms, it's because it came from America. So you have America as the absolute craziest, then you have Britannia and her lion cubs, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as the second tier crazies, because, Canada likes to take up every bad American idea like 2 years later. In Britain, the thing is just to mock and jeer and hoot at the crazy Americans and then take it up even more insanely, which is why J.K. Rowling is getting beaten up on Twitter every day for being a transphobe or whatever. And then you get to Western Europe, and you get to France, where Macron says, we're not taking down a single statue or changing a single street name, because they're all part of our history. And he just said that, and I got no use for Macron. He's like this dinky little Euro globalist. But he made the whole statue toppling thing go away just with that sentence. And he regards wokeism as an existential threat to the French Republic. And he has education ministers in the French education ministry who will say that. You can't find anybody in the Department of Education in Washington to say it, but you can find a French civil servant to say it. And then you go further east and you get to what used to be the Iron Curtain, and behind there, they've recovered their freedom recently enough to know what all this toxic garbage is about. And I think, I don't understand, at some point American conservatism which is desperately stale and tired at the official level, at the think tank level, and at the, conservative magazine level, if you can still find one, has to actually confront that head on as to why they're having absolutely no. It's interesting to me, all the three phenomena of the pushback. Yeah, the Tea Party in whatever it was, 2009, and then Trump in 2015, and now these people showing up at school boards and being mad over critical race theory. All these three phenomena had nothing to do with the conservative establishment, whether political or whether the think tanks. So that should tell you something. That should tell those guys about the disconnect.
But then the Heritage Foundation still exists, and it's got a budget, I believe, is hundreds of millions of dollars a year.
Yeah.
Why is that? If you've got 40 years of total uselessness under your belt, why do you persist?
I honestly, I think of it in a way a bit like the contemporary art market in New York, which, as you know, is crazier than anywhere on the planet, as we've just seen with 500,000 for Hunter Biden. But clearly, there's a lot of excess cash in the system,
right?
And those rich guys, pay 500,000 for a Hunter Biden. They might otherwise just be putting it up their nose or whatever. Who knows what they'd be doing with it? And I think at a certain level, a lot of that think tank establishment is like that. And nothing. It's a comfortable world. And none of the, as you said, I live in a part of America that's not glamorous, even in northern New England terms. I don't have a compound or at Kennebunkport. I'm not in a converted inn in Woodstock, Vermont, or those kind. David French. Do you remember David French? He was the guy at National Review.
Vaguely. That
Bill Kristol, your old friend, had decided was going to be the challenger to Trump.
Oh, right.
Which again, no sane person would ever entertain. I had a rather cheap line that, David French has all the qualities of leadership except followers, which is a cruel and catty and bitchy and malicious line, but happens to have the great merit of truth. And so Bill Kristol, because David French doesn't know whether he wants to run for president. He's doing his Hamlet routine. And so Bill Kristol flies him up to Woodstock, Vermont, and they hole up there for a weekend to try and talk David French into running against Donald Trump. And the fact that they picked Woodstock, Vermont, because if you go 50 miles north, south, east, or west, you will see ruin and you will see wreckage.
Go to St. Johnsbury.
Yes. St. Johnsbury, where as somebody said a couple of years ago, there are more people at the needle sharing clinic than at the farmers market. Right. These are ruined. My daughter started at McGill in Montreal at university there, and I drove her up there and we had dinner and we're walking through the town late at night, and I said to her, this is your first time away. You've led a really sheltered life in small town New England. You've got to be serious now. You're in a big town. There's all kinds of predators and all that. And she goes to me, "Oh, Dad, there's less crime here than in St. Johnsbury." And she's, businesses are broken into in St. J every night.
I know.
And Bill Kristol has no awareness of this. And so he has his pushback against Donald Trump. He goes to Woodstock, Vermont. The next time he organizes a thing against Donald Trump, he actually does the Spectre board meeting scene from James Bond, where they're all meeting in the hollowed out volcano. He flies the donor class into a private island off, I think it was off the Carolina coast. I can't remember whether it's north or south. To some luxurious thing. And Bill Kristol is actually sitting around in the hollowed out volcano with the, 15 biggest donors to the Republican Party plotting how they can engineer things so that Bill Kristol can press the button and lower Trump into the shark tank, and which would not go well for the shark, by the way. I just don't how if you drive around America, you cannot not be aware of how these towns have ceased to function and of how you have downward mobility, which is the opposite of the American dream. The American dream is, oh yeah, I arrived at Ellis Island and I was penniless and I was living in a tenement on the Lower East Side. And then my kid moved uptown and my grandson became a doctor and got a place in Westchester County. Then, you know, my great-grandson goes to Harvard and becomes an environmental lawyer, shutting down all the dams in California, and the cycle begins again. But if you don't have upward mobility, you don't have the American dream. I mean, people were, I was a peasant in the 12th century, and my great-grandson was a peasant in the 14th century, and his great-grandson was a peasant in the 16th century, and eventually we think, to hell with this, let's get on the boat and go to America. So if you now have generational downward mobility, you've got the opposite of America going on right there.
It's just fascinating to me that all of this began, you could have been anywhere because your train broke down.
Well, you know, it's all like that. My whatever it was, great grandparents, I think it was, they were in Odessa, and they sold up everything. They wanted to get out of Tsarist Russia, and they sold up everything, and they bought tickets for New York. And the boat put in on the Irish coast en route to America, and they looked out the portholes and they saw hovels, but they weren't like hovels like back in Russia. Some of them were like 2-story hovels. So they thought, this must be the New York skyscrapers we've heard about. And they got off the boat thinking that they were in New York, and eventually some obliging Irishman said, oh, no, we don't have the skyscrapers like they have in New York. We've got, sure, there's a feed store, there's a 3-story feed store downtown, but that's about the only thing we have. And by that time, the boat was sailing to New York, and so they were stuck in Ireland. And I told that to an anti-immigration advocate here in the US. He said, that's the saddest immigration story I've ever heard. And,
did they stay?
Yeah, they did stay, and actually they did very well. My great aunt, who became a rather distinguished Irish painter, she did the illustrations for original illustrations for James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake.
No way.
And my other great aunt, he was a big IRA guy. He was actually an Irish Republican at a time when, years before anybody else was an Irish Republican, and got a big IRA military funeral. So they did well there. But, basically I took a century or whatever it was to basically catch up with where they should have been back in the 1890s. It's and actually, I think if you are, there's always a sense of regret that it becomes necessary to move. I mean, I don't mean necessary in legal term, refugee or whatever, but that an immigrant always, the part you left behind, and the reason, if you think about that seriously, you want what the Statue of Liberty is, which is liberty reaching her beacon out to the world, to shine upon the world, so that people adopt American ideas and people people understand the flaws in their own system and correct the flaws in their system. And instead, we stapled a third-rate poem to the bottom of the statue and turned it into a statue of immigration, which is a completely different thing. But I don't see what's humane and compassionate about denuding developing countries of their best and brightest. And I don't see there's anything humane or kindly about that at all.
No, it's awful.